Well, good evening. I'm Kevin Hoffman. I'm here to talk about a book I translated from German into English. The original book was published in 1914. I'll talk a little bit about myself because that kind of leads into why I did the translation, and then we'll have a little presentation about, well, I'll talk about why I did what the book is about, I'm sorry. and then if you're interested in it, I can talk about the publishing process because that's been quite an adventure for me too. So are most of you from the New Ulm area? I was here 2 years ago for our 45th anniversary class reunion, and when I was at the class reunion, I graduated in the class of 72. So one of my classmates came up to me and said, "Kevin, you haven't changed a bit since high school. You look just like you did back then." And I'm thinking, no wonder I couldn't get a date in high school. and then the granddaughter of one of my classmates was interested in following me around, and she said, "I'd really like to date you." And I'm like, "Huh?" So I was telling one of my classmates, "Yeah, this young, attractive girl, she's studying her master's degree and she wants to date me." And he said, "Oh, don't get too excited. She's doing her thesis on carbon-14 dating." So that's my icebreaker. So anyone who grew up in the New Ulm area was surrounded by reminders of the Sioux Uprising. You all know the Sioux Center Street Monument, the Kiesling House, the Waraju Distillery. I drove by it today. It's still standing in Westside Park. There's the Morels in the auditorium of the middle school. Berg's Battery. There's still when I was a kid, there were still bullet holes visible in some of the buildings downtown. And of course, the Brown County Museum, which used to be in the basement of the library here. And just being surrounded by all that history, you had to learn something or be interested. When I was young, a lot of people in New Ulm still spoke German. My dad had a furniture store. People would come in there, and they loved to talk all afternoon in German to each other. And of course, by the time I was growing up, their German was a little mixed with English, so it wasn't as pure anymore, but they loved that. When my dad served in the military during the war, he was over in Germany, and after the war he was in the MPs, and one of his jobs was to translate between the local Germans and the American military. And he got a nickname from the German ladies, das Deutsch Verderber, which means the one who corrupts our language. So during the summer, when I was growing up, I'd get jobs mowing lawn for various people in town, and that's how I always had some spending money. And one of the ladies I had a lawn mowing job for was named Mrs. Hermerding, Mrs. Ida Hermerding. And one day she asked me to come and help her clean her basement. And when I was helping her clean her basement, she had some books on a shelf, and one of them was this book called Neu, and it was in German, and I was fascinated. I pulled it down, I was looking at the pictures, and I was trying to read it, and I asked her if I couldn't take it home and read it, and she gave it to me. She said, "No, I like you, I want you to have that book, you can remember me by that." And so I took the book home, and then it went in a box because I was busy. my mom told me in her later years, she said, Kevin, I don't know if I should tell you this, but when I was in a meeting with your first grade teacher, she told me that you would never amount to anything. You just had no future. Well, luckily I didn't know that, so I kept up my lawn mowing jobs and I saved money. I got a small scholarship and I went to college in Mankato, graduated, worked nights, paid my way through, and I got a job with Spare Univac up in Eagan, Minnesota. And my career just took off. During the early years, I spent a lot of time on destroyers out at sea, and I was like Dr. Spock. If you've ever watched Star Trek, their computer needs something fixed, so Dr. Spock could reprogram it and it would do the new thing. Well, I was doing the same thing for the Navy. They'd come up to me and they'd say, you know, we need this software to do something it wasn't programmed to do, but it would sure be good. And there's time after time where I said, okay, and I wrote the patch. It was in machine code in those days, because it's not like today where we just recompile everything. There was one occasion where they had this line printer that was really slow. I'm sorry, the line printer was relatively fast, but they had this DEEC that you could actually literally type faster than it could print. But that's where they had chosen the program to send the radar alignment test to, and they couldn't move on to the next test till that was printed out. So I wrote the patch for them and redirected all the outputs so it went to that line printer, and they cut a whole day off their sea trials because they didn't have to refuel the aircraft and get more aircraft to do all their alignments. So that was just one of my accomplishments during that time. Later, I did the same thing on P3s. We'd fly out over the Atlantic on test flights, and we'd have new hardware and radars and stuff to test, and they liked having me there because when they'd write up a problem, it's not the same as seeing it firsthand, and you could investigate stuff right while you were there. But I have gotten off the track here, so I'll get back on track. I graduated from Mankato State with a bachelor's degree in computer science, math, and business. Got my job at Spare Univac. Later, I got married and we bought a house. And a later contract I was working on was up in Montreal. And when I came back from there, we built an addition. So we were really busy. But then it got to be in the 90s, and I remembered that book. And so I dug it out and I read through it, and it's like, you know, this is a really good story. It's fiction, but it's historical fiction, and all the events woven into the story are true events that really happened in New Ulm in southern Minnesota and out in Gettysburg. And so I thought, you know, I want to make this available in English. So I worked on the translation. It took me a couple of years because I didn't work every night, but I finished it, and then it sat there because I was waiting for the resources to be able to publish it. And finally, couple years ago, I was contacted by a publishing house, and I said, yeah, if I'm ever going to do this, let's do it. So I got it published. It was about 2 years ago, and it's available now out on the web. Maybe I'll play my video. Well, let me talk about the book a little bit. So it's a very suspenseful, action-packed thriller. It's got a love story woven into the plot. I was impressed because there's a couple classic love stories that you can see glimpses of in this book. You've all heard of Romeo and Juliet. Well, there's a scene in this book where the hero believes his betrothed has been killed, so he thinks she's dead. And then if you've seen Farewell to Arms or read that book, of course, the parallel there is that he gets wounded and goes to a hospital. And then Gone with the Wind is another one. There's elements of New Ulm was virtually burnt to the ground as Atlanta was during that movie. So it's a very well organized and laid out love story. It's a good read. And it has the suspense because you don't know what's coming. You don't know how it's going to turn out, and I'm not going to tell you. So in New Ulm was the largest and most intense battle of the Sioux Uprising. There were, during the second battle, 32 people killed, 60 wounded, and that was about a third of the people defending about 2,000 people who had taken refuge here. And the Indians believed it was a good time to attack because most of the young men were off in the Civil War, and they were right. There was not a lot of people left to defend the city. Even Fort Ritchley, which had a small military, but they had cannon, which New Ulm did not have, they had like 3 killed and a couple dozen wounded. So New Ulm was really it was a major affair. It was not just a little blimp. When everyone knows about General Custer, Battle of Little Bighorn, 225 of his men and him were wiped out. In the Southern Minnesota Uprising, over 800 people were massacred and some 30,000 displaced from their homes. So that was a big event in history. At this time, I'd like to play this. This is from my website. So on my website, you can order the book and buy it. I also have books here that if you wish to purchase one, I'll sign it. The paperbacks are $10. The hard copies are $20, which is a good deal because on the website they're a little more. Let me just play this video.
Trial and Triumph is a book about the love between Walter and Elsie during the Sioux Uprising of 1862. How true love knows no adversity.
I'm also currently engaged in getting a screenplay finished for the book with hopes of transitioning the story into a movie. And that seems to be progressing quite well. As part of that, there's a much longer video trailer with real actors that I really liked, but it's not ready yet. They kept saying it would be done by now, but now they're saying maybe another week. So I've got a lot of things in the works, but I'll just scroll through my website. So there's some reviews out here. At the top of the website is the title Trial and Triumph. And you can click here to buy the book. I'll give you all, whether you buy a book or not, I've got bookmarkers that have my website on it, so you can take that home with you if nothing else. And then there's some book reviews, and then there's the video, and there's a paragraph about me, but probably a lot less than I've already just told you. And so the publishing process is kind of an interesting thing because I didn't know what I was getting into. And so they start out and they give you a package, and they said, for this much money, we'll get you published. And sure enough, they did that. They built the website for me. They made the book available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Litfire, who is the publisher. And so then I thought, okay, good, I'm done. And they said, well, you have to go to these book fairs. Well, to go to the book fair, you have to pay a lot more money. They have to do special videos and interviews, and they took that over to Frankfurt. And you don't sell any books at a book fair because everyone there is authors trying to sell their books. But it gets you exposed to people that are interested in looking for ideas for movies. And so then I started being contacted by people that, oh, this is a great story and it would make a great movie. And I agree, but I never knew where they were coming from, if they were sincere, if they're trying to get more money out of me. But finally, I decided, if I don't do this, I wish I had. So I jumped in feet first, and it's looking promising now. And so maybe a year from now, you'll start hearing about this movie coming out. So that's about it. If you have any questions, anybody? Talk about? Oh, yeah, good question. Frederick P. Meyer. I have not been able to find any information about him except that during that time period in the early 1900s, stories about the American West were very popular in Germany. And so people would come over here, gather information, and then go back to Germany and write stories that presumably sold quite well in Europe and actually enticed people to come to America. So that's all I've ever found from him. The publishing house where the book was published in Germany doesn't exist anymore, and it was unfortunately in that zone between Germany and Poland that got destroyed during the war. So that's all I know about him, but maybe if someone sees this that has more information, they'll be able to enlighten me more. It'd be very interesting. I unfortunately did not ask her, and she was old and has passed away. I wish I had talked to her more, but when you're 17 years old, you just don't think about those things.
I think in your interview with the journal, you talked about how you had tried to do more of a word-for-word translation.
Yes. Oh, yeah, so the translation, I tried to stay true to the book. I didn't deviate much, but the author had made some mistakes. He didn't know the area like I do. He didn't know the Rice River is Rice Creek, and he didn't know some things. There were also idioms in German. That was quite interesting. the Germans will say something like, "Why'd you throw the gun in the grain?" Well, we don't talk like that in English, so we like, what's he talking about? Well, in German, that means don't give up so easily, you know? Also, they talked around stuff back in those days. Maybe it's a German culture, maybe it's just the times, but they would not use a word like rape. They would say deeply violated. It's a different time than it is today. So there's things like that you will come across in the story. So there are Indian words in the book too, and I kept them because they add color to the story. So one of the expressions the Sioux would use, that's used in the book is pakachi, which I may not be pronouncing right because I don't know Sioux, but it meant flee, get away. And another word that's very common was nipo, which means kill. So Sioux is a very unknown language to people, so it's kind of actually fun to have exposure to some of their language in some of the stories. And back in the early 1900s when this was first published, there was still a lot of people that were very fluent in Sioux. I'm not sure today if that's true.
There is several different places where there's language camps and things like that.
Yeah.
MSU does have a Glenn Wasakuna happens to be Dakota, and he does
Okay.
does language lessons and things like that. Does his wife Glenn.
Yeah.
And then I think they've got some over in Brookings, South Dakota.
Yeah, so they're keeping their language alive, but the general public gets very little exposure to it. Dances with Wolves, I remember they had some Sioux expressions in there, like katanka or something, buffalo, yeah. So, yeah, so it all helps. It was actually an unfortunate tragedy. We wish it hadn't happened, but it did in its history. So
was the book in the public domain?
yes, the original book passed to the public domain after 100 years, because that's the laws it was published under. But I can copyright the translation as a derivative work, and it's a new derivative work. And it doesn't really matter if someone else translates the same thing as long as I didn't use their material. So,
Plans to do any other ones?
yeah, I'm fascinated about history. That's a good question. There's a lot of family things that come up that people say, yeah, Kevin, you should do this, but they don't realize how expensive it is. My grandfather, for example, was born in Germany on my mother's side, and when he was a young man, he liked to travel, and he served in the German Navy. That was at the turn of the century, so that was before any of the wars. But after that, he thought, well, I like to see the world, and so he'd get a job as a coal shoveler on a steamship, and he'd go to another port, and then he'd take his pay, and when that ran out, he'd go to another port and travel around. Well, he heard about this brand new ship they were building over, I think it was in Belfast, called the Titanic. And so he worked it out so that he could be over there, because the way they hired crews is right before they left, they'd open the gates and take on however many firemen they needed. And so he, unfortunately, well, fortunately actually, he got over there and he came in on a ship and is late and he was tired, and the way my mom tells it, he always liked to sleep. And so he overslept, and so when he finally got down to the shipyard, they had just closed the gates and the ship left without him. And he's the way he tells it, he was really disappointed. But later he heard the ship sank and he didn't feel so bad. that was his words. Later he got himself a ride over to the United States on a different ship, and I had the name, but I don't remember it now, and actually went to a port in South America, walked around and saw that, and then he worked his way up to Florida, and there was some hurricane. He got a job as a shrimper on a shrimp boat, and there was some hurricane. It was early in the century, and I don't know which one, and they were caught out there. They didn't have the warnings they do nowadays, and that convinced him he never wanted to go see the ocean again, and he moved to Kansas. And he homesteaded some land, and then the Dust Bowl hit him, and he walked away from that land, and guess what? Today, they're pumping oil on that land. So, but he moved his family up to Iowa and then to Minnesota and ended up staying in New Ulm because of the German community. And he actually wanted to go to Canada after they had land in the river bottom, and that flooded out. And he said, that's enough of that. He's going to take his family up to Canada. And my grandmother put the kibosh on that. She said, you're going without me because I'm not moving. So that's just an interesting side story. I could talk about myself all day, I guess. But there was my sister married a Korean man, and he brought his family over here, and that was kind of a fun afternoon, and they wanted to take them fishing. And I was a college student, and I had one fishing line with one bobber on it, and so I dug some worms up, and we went to the lake over by Mankato, and the first cast I made, the line broke, and the sinker and bobber flew out into the lake. And my sister said, well, that's the end of our fishing. And I thought, oh, no, I can do this. So I swam out, and I got the bobber, and as I was bringing it back, a fish bit on it. So when I got to water, I could stand up. I held up the bobber with the fish. And these Koreans are looking with these puzzled faces, and then they said something, and my sister translated. She said, they think Americans have a funny way of fishing. So I made an impression internationally too.
So with the screenplay, are you doing the writing on that, or are you consulting?
Well, they wanted it professionally done. I think I could have done it, but they wouldn't. The people I'm dealing with want it real pros, and actually I'm impressed with their work. They've cut a lot of things that are in the book. So if you want the full story, you need the book. The movie's going to be more streamlined, and it kind of focuses on the main theme and plot without. The book gets a little sidetracked in places, which I liked because it drew in the history. So so I'm getting to edit the screenplay and suggest changes to it, and they're taking me seriously, and so it's like, yeah, I have real input, but I think they've done a good job on it. So one of the guys is saying their plans are to start choosing the actors in June, which is very soon, because the filming would have to be done in July or August. And so if that doesn't happen this year, it would have to be next year, because you can't film those scenes in the winter. But I have no idea where they plan to do it. It's still, I don't know where it's going to end up, but like I said, you know, I took it this far. I think I might as well see this through and see where it ends up. And so if I didn't, I'd wish I had. So.
Would the movie take the same title then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So the original book I translated was called Noam, but I changed it to Trial and Triumph. And I fixed a few errors in the story. He'd call this one chief Big Eagle, and then he'd call him Black Eagle. But it was all obviously the same guy, so I fixed stuff like that. And he had, well, I shouldn't give much away, but he had that Indian being killed, and Big Eagle, of course, was a real chief during the Sioux Uprising, and he was not killed. He survived and actually provided a lot of historical insight. So a lot of, from what I can tell, the Second Battle of New Ulm, Little Crow did lead that, but some historical accounts claim he wasn't there, so you gotta choose which version you're gonna believe. A lot of the settlers claim they saw Little Crow at the battle on a white horse, which he of course did ride, but Chief Winnebago also had a white horse, but Chief Winnebago was actually in the peace camp, and he did not support the war, so it's kind of hard to imagine him leading the attack on New Ulm because he was against the whole war to begin with. So, but what really happened, I don't, you can just read what's written.
Does the contents of the book in its original form indicate to you that the author spent time in New Ulm or lived in New Ulm for a period of time?
Yes, and it's obvious that he gathered anecdotes from survivors, and he wove all of that into the story. There's, during the battle, he talks about the blacksmith making some cannons from stovepipes. And I thought, well, that's kind of hard to believe. But when I really went out and researched it, there was an eyewitness account of the memoirs of one survivor from the battle who said, yeah, they had actually fashioned these to make the Sioux think they had cannon when they really didn't. The Sioux did not like the cannon. That's what caused them to give up on Fort Ridgely, and they thought New Ulm would be an easy prize because they knew there were no cannon there. And in addition, there was a lot more plunder in New Ulm. It was a very prospering community at the time. After, it was only a couple months later, so they evacuated New Ulm basically to Mankato and then St. Peter. A lot of the settlers left. They did not come back because when they came from Germany, they were not told that there were people who would contest this land. They were told it was free for the taking. And so, but then a lot of people did come back and rebuild their homes and of course, New Ulm's here today, or wouldn't be here if they hadn't. So it was quite a time. There was a Mrs. Krieger who had a farm just outside of town, who a lot of her family was killed, including her husband and most of her children, but she survived, and she's got an incredible story. Her story's kind of woven into the book a little bit. They keep coming across her. So if you like historical events, but it's in a fictional setting, you'll enjoy the read. And there's a lot you can learn, and then it would trigger you to say, oh, I'm going to go read up on that and see how that actually played out. So it's a good way maybe to get young people interested in our history. And there's a theme going through the story of the two main characters just, they had a deep love, but for a while he thought she was dead and he had nothing to live for. So, and she desperately, she recovered, and then she knew that he didn't know she was alive, and she tried everything she could. And in those times they didn't have an internet, so it was hard they'd get casualty lists from battles, and they'd read them to make sure nobody they knew had died. And I mean, it was a pretty horrific time to live through.
Sounded like this was your first book that you translated. How did you prepare yourself translating? How do we know you quite a few German words, but it sounds like there's a lot.
Well, I took German in high school, and whenever I was at home, my dad and I liked to talk in German. Needless to say, there was a lot of vocabulary in the book that I had to look up. It wasn't, I wasn't that fluid in it, but it was written in the old German script, so I had been exposed to plenty of that, and so I knew how the Germans drew an S or these different characters, and so I knew what that was. So I didn't really have a problem. I just started reading it, and then I translated it. So I never gave it a second thought. It just happened. But yeah, if anyone's interested in buying a signed copy, I can play the video once more. I was kind of proud of the video, but then when I saw the new one, I thought, oh, this makes my old one look kind of not as great.
A classic tale of love in time of war.
Drum beats.
Two lovers, separated by tragic events, found the will to live and fight, in hopes of finding each other again and living in the hope of being reunited. Trial and Triumph is a book about the love between Walter and Elsie during the Sioux Uprising of 1862, and how true love knows no adversity.